What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, I'm gonna go through another paper for you guys today. This is on human mating strategies. Let's look here at the next slide. I'll tell you what it is, the current paper. So, this is called The Sexual Selection of Human Mating Strategies, Mate Preferences, and Competition Tactics. This is chapter 1 in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships by David Buss. So, going on to the first slide, some background here. What are we going to start this with? Natural selection, sexual selection. Theories given to us by Charles Darwin, right? They go way back to the early 19th century. So, natural selection, what is it? This favors traits that lead to greater survival. Survival of the fittest, right? And fittest in this case doesn't mean the strongest, the most jacked. It means the most likely to produce viable offspring that will go on to reproduce themselves. So, traits are selected for by weeding out the less fit, selection for the fittest. But sometimes traits are picked that are not the fittest traits. And that's kind of the question there, is why do some traits seem to get picked that are not necessarily conducive to natural selection? This was kind of a puzzle for Charles Darwin, and then he came up with sexual selection. Point 2 here. These are traits that lead to greater mating success, right? Because if you have traits that mean that someone is going to mate more, they're going to get picked more, they can pass on those genes, even if those traits are not necessarily naturally selected for, or traits that are, directly enhancing of fitness. They could even hinder an organism's chance of survival as long as they increase the mating success of that organism. So, classic example of this, of course, the peacock's tail, right? Very high in metabolic cost. It puts the peacock at greater risk of predation, but the peacock's tail is selected for simply because the female peacock likes it more. Two pathways to this, right? Sexual selection we're talking about here. Intrasexual selection. This is intrasexual, so male-male or female-female. This is when members of the same species compete with one another for mates, and then we have intersexual selection, which is essentially mate choice, right? How do members of one sex get selected by the other sex? Heritable traits are selected because members of the opposite sex like them for whatever reason. We'll get into what some of those might be. In human beings, important, we see strong preferential or intersexual selection. Some animals are not like that. Human beings are, right? There's a high degree of mate choice, particularly perhaps in a modern environment. Women pick the males that they like. Let's go on now to the next slide. Talking about women picking the males that they like, speaking of that, we're talking about parental investment theory by Trivers, okay? Which sex chooses and which sex competes to be chosen by that sex. So, parental investment theory tells us that the sex that invests more in reproduction, which is women in human beings, is the sex that typically chooses, okay? There are examples of this where it's reversed in some animals, and we see the same thing, right? So very well supported theory. The Mormon cricket, for example, the male invests more, so, it's the one that's the chooser in that sense. So intersexual selection, or intersexual selection here, I should say, in humans applies a little bit more to females, okay, to women. Intersexual competition, on the other hand, if men are competing to be chosen, applies a little bit more to males. Maybe, right? There's some indication that women compete, high intersexual competition among women, but in different ways, in covert ways. Men compete overtly, contest competitions, fighting, that sort of thing, physically. Women more like gossip and all of that. But that's for another video. What else are we looking at here? So, another concept to introduce, the Bateman gradient. And this is the steepness of the slope between mating success and reproductive success. What does that mean? Sexual access to more mates, it pays off more for the lower investing species, right? So access to more mates, more promiscuity, that kind of a thing, selecting more mates, a less selective strategy pays off more for men because men are the less investing of the two sexes in human beings. We say investment here. The more investing, the less investing. What does that mean? Basically, the costs of childcare, okay, is what we're talking about here. The cost of pregnancy, 9 months of gestation, that sort of thing. Having to rear a child, the inability to forage or to hunt while pregnant, those sorts of things. So, there's very large empirical support for the observations of Trivers and Bateman both. This is something, that, part of evolutionary theory kind of persists today. Older theories, but just as applicable now as they were then. Let's go on now to the next slide. Leading us now more to evolutionary psychology, sexual strategies, and sexual strategies theory, developed by David Buss. Sexual selection theory. But there's two fundamental adaptive problems here, kind of unique to human beings. We want to increase opposite sex preferential mate choice, so behaviors that increase being picked, basically, and outcompeting rival mates who can also be desirable. So, like I said, for men, that could be physical competitions, but it can also be social competitions, which is something we actually see much more, both in men and women. Male-male competitions, therefore, they can kind of magnify female choice, right? Women desire men who win these competitions, but the kinds of competitions that men have is also kind of dictated by the preferences of the choosers, right? By women. So, mate preferences by one sex, women in this case, can dictate the kind of competitions that men engage in for attention. For example, do women value being brave? You might see a culture kind of emerge where men compete, like who is the bravest one on the block. Male and female mating strategies, they also vary by the individual, right? There are individual differences in most psychological traits. Men can be high or low in investment. Women can be high or low in the investment of their own offspring. Men and women can be high competitors, right? They can engage in more enhancing strategies to be chosen by the opposite sex, et cetera, et cetera. An example of that, as far as high or low investors, pair bonding, long-term mate selection, we'll probably call it that throughout this video, versus casual sex or short-term mate selection, that kind of a thing. What is the sexual strategy being employed there? Is it a long-term strategy with high pair bonding, retaining a mate for a long period of time, investing heavily in the offspring? Men and women do this. Or is it a short-term strategy? Get someone pregnant and leave, that kind of a thing. Well, let's go on. So some premises here of sexual strategies theory, going through this, just kind of quoting from this chapter. Humans have evolved distinct mate-specific adaptations, okay? So these are adaptations we've evolved to solve mating problems and reaping benefits from a given sexual strategy, short-term, long-term, more specific sexual strategies, whatever the case may be. Premise 2 here, sex similarity in mating psychology. So we see some shared similarities in mating psychology of men and women both. When does this occur? When the two sexes face similar adaptive challenges, men and women have evolved similar mating strategies in mating psychology. So this is when you're going to see fewer sex differences or no sex differences, right? When the adaptive problems faced by men and women are similar. Sex differences in mating psychology. Premise 3, when men and women face different adaptive challenges, the mating psychologies and strategies of men and women will show sex differences, okay? There are some common long-term mating challenges shared by both sexes: commitment, traits and behaviors that enhance long-term relationship formation and maintenance, pair bonding, that sort of a thing. Having similar mate value trajectories, selecting mates with low burdens, right? If it's disease or debt or costs. Previous paternity could be an example of that. Lots of these. So those are common ones shared by men and women. Part 2, let's go on here. What else? There's male-specific long-term mating challenges, right? Some of those, key ones here. Finding mates that are high in reproductive value and also ensuring paternity certainty. So women that can reproduce and women that that you reproduce with are going to basically be carrying your child and not that of another man. Some female-specific long-term mating challenges, on the other hand: resource acquisition, investment in relationships, fidelity or faithfulness, that kind of a thing. Protection is another one, right? Investing in a long-term mate who's able to protect you. We can look at some male-specific short-term challenges, on the other hand. Having a lower need to invest or being able to exercise a strategy with low investment. So how can that manifest? The higher male desire for multiple sex partners, the tendency for men to initiate sex earlier in a relationship, and all kinds of tactics for like minimizing commitment, right? So men are seeking to minimize commitment. Women, on the other hand, may be seeking more to gain commitment, or at least not seeking to minimize commitment to the extent that men do in these short-term mating strategies, so to speak. And we have some female-specific short-term mating strategies as well. What are these? One of those could be gaining immediate accesses to resources. You could think of something like sex work, for example. Getting high-quality genes, right? So the idea that short-term mating is selection for good genes. Mate switching as well. So in that case, a short-term strategy can also be kind of a springboard into a long-term strategy. We tend to think of the two as like these distinct things. Often they're not. And the initial short-term strategy can in turn become a long-term strategy. I think in a modern environment, we see that like how many hookups and casual sex become long-term relationships. People have sex very early because they want to secure a long-term mate, whatever the case may be. So mate switching, short-term strategies can then be springboards to long-term strategies. Let's go on now. There's context specificity of sexual strategies, meaning that the environment, the given context, dictates what might be applied and how people can shift their own strategy. So sex ratio, right? The number of men in the population to women. If you have 150 men to 100 women, you're going to have very different behavior. If you have 150 women in the population to 100 men, you're going to have different behavior. They will adjust their strategies accordingly. We'll go into that, how and what kind of things we would expect. Mate value as well. We know that people kind of adjust their own mate preferences based on their own mate value. So if someone has high mate value, if they have a huge increase in mate value, they may become more selective. So that's another context one. Social norms, right? The society around us kind of dictates how these strategies are going to be expressed. Sex-based mortality, kind of related to sex ratio. Are people more likely to die earlier or do they live long lives? Cultural mating systems, kind of related to social norms. Food scarcity as well. We see this in women. If you look at the past video on women's estrus and that sort of a thing, we know that there's some regulation. When food is scarce, people might be less willing to invest in having offspring in that moment. Past children as well, right? People might be less willing to invest if a mate currently has past children. I think we see that in men and women now, that, individuals who have past children or that sort of a thing, they struggle to date a little bit, okay? So sexual strategies are also evolved psychological solutions and their behavioral manifestations. So these are dispositions, tendencies, psychological things, and also the way that we act upon those. So they're sensitive psychological features. They activate or suppress sexual behaviors. So they can increase desire, suppress desire, attraction, arousal, competition, jealousy, all of these emotions that evolved to facilitate mating, pair bonding, short-term strategies, long-term strategies, whatever. Many of these emotions that we evolved have a role in facilitating reproduction, okay? Humans also have little conscious awareness of their mating strategy, or their mating psychology, I should say. This doesn't mean that people are going to be totally unaware of it. There can be like some partial awareness, but it's not something that's implied. So when we talk about short-term strategies, long-term strategies, women want to do this, men want to do this. This want is often not an explicit want. It's often not an actual cognition where it's like, I want to enhance my reproductive value. I want to reproduce with as many people as possible. That's kind of describing, want in evolutionary terms. It's not the actual thoughts going on in people's heads. So let's go on now to the next slide. Preferential mate choice. We talked about this a little bit. We don't mate randomly, okay? And according to this paper, there's no known species that does mate randomly. We don't just hook up with whoever. We choose mates, right? Through a number of mechanisms. We don't mate randomly, okay? So mate preferences become especially important for the sex that invests more, or in high investing mating context, long-term versus short-term. This makes people pickier, and the sex that invests more is pickier. And again, that's a big sex difference that we see between men and women. Very well replicated. Women are pickier. They're choosier. They don't have sex as early. They have higher standards. They're less likely to have casual sex. Go back to the videos on Clark and Hatfield, for example, where they send, attractive Confederates. Confederate is an assistant researcher. I don't know if they use that term anymore. But they send these attractive assistants up to random people on campus, men and women approaching the opposite sex, saying, hey, would you like to have sex with me tonight? Something like 80% of men agree to just go home and have sex with a stranger. None of the women do in these. They don't. So big sex differences. Some of the largest ones we see in that research there behaviorally. There are cross-culturally shared mating preferences, right? So things we see across all cultures, universal mating preferences, right? Good health, dependability, kindness, intelligence, and honesty, okay? So, these tend to be positive things, and that's something that we tend to see. There's research on the dark triad. Are antisocial traits attractive? In some contexts they can enhance mating success, but generally cross-cultural, universal mating preferences tend to be for pro-social behavior, traits that facilitate investment in offspring and long-term relationship formation. Maybe a little bit of a white pill there for you. So imagine how all of these kinds of things facilitate reproductive fitness. These, cross-culturally shared mating preferences, right? So, as far as good health, you have a robust and a healthy phenotype, someone who's going to survive and make it, they have good genes perhaps as well. Good genes is kind of a broad term. It can mean many different things, but it can, represent physical traits, right, like being strong or whatever the case may be, resistance to disease and parasites, being muscular or tall, and also behavioral traits as well, right, because all of behavior is heritable, right? 50% generally across the board of personality, psychology, behavior, heritable. So there's a willingness to invest and protect an offspring, which facilitates the survival of offspring and reproductive fitness, and also the ability to do so. So willingness and an ability to invest and protect, right? And something to consider about investment, I think I didn't mention this in the past, but you know, we a lot of the discourse on investment talks about like money and that sort of thing. That's certainly a big part of it, but it's also about like who is willing to be there with a partner, who's willing to protect them and spend time with them, investing your time and your effort and all of that. Are you invested broadly in the relationship or are you not? Okay. There's also an unwillingness, right? If you look at something like intelligence, honesty, kindness, to harm you as a potential mate, which is very important for female selection of mates. And so that's also why we see some signs of male dominance and things kind of have a paradoxical effect, because it's like, okay, he could protect me, but at the same time, he would be much more likely, or at least have much more ability to harm me. So there have to be signs like, okay, he can protect, he's able to do this, but he's also not going to harm me. I can trust him. He's kind. You know, he's going to be upfront with his intentions and that sort of a thing. Okay, I think it was Jeffrey Miller, the evolutionary psychologist, who coined the term the tender defender, right? So someone who's able to protect and all of that, but who at the same time is, you know, a invested, tender kind of mate in that sense, who will actually protect you, who is not going to, you know, be able to beat out the competition, but who will also, you know, beat you. So next slide here. The evolution of love, as I mentioned, a lot of these emotions evolved concurrent with pair bonding as a human mating strategy. Pair bonding basically is the dominant human mating strategy. Humans pair bond very long periods of time, unlike many animals, right? The experience of universal love, or excuse me, the experience of romantic love, love in general, it's a universal thing, right? It's a human universal, probably an evolved mate commitment device, right? As they say in this paper. You know, there's some people have said, oh, this was like a European thing invented in the Renaissance or the medieval period, late medieval period. Probably not. It's probably not a European invention. It's something you see across all cultures that have been examined. So love as well, it's prioritized as a mate selection criteria across cultures, right? Any culture you look at, you know, it kind of ranks at the top. You want to have a partner or something like that who's going to love you. Okay, so that's a big one. Love also involves kind of this willingness to forego other potential mates. So as I said, pair bonding, dominant human mating strategy. Serial monogamy, the dominant human mating strategy. Humans form dyadic pair bonds for long periods of time. It doesn't mean, you know, people pick their first mate and then stay with them until they die, but they form long-term pair bonds, okay? Desire for marriage, commitment, children, sharing and investing resources. All of these are big signs like I'm going to invest fully in you, commit to you, I'm going to forego other mates, and now it's just us two, okay? So love predicts things like relationship satisfaction above and beyond most other measures as well, including sexual desire, including how attracted you are to a partner or how much you want to have sex with them. So that's kind of it, you know, for like relationship satisfaction here. What really makes people happy together in a relationship? What relationships have really high satisfaction? Relationships where people say they love each other more, basically, where there's high romantic love in that relationship. Let's go on now. Next slide. So we can look at some male-specific long-term mating preferences. So mating preferences that just apply to men in this case. There's a couple of big ones here, okay? Choosing fertile and reproductively valuable women. This is, you know, again, kind of cross-culturally replicated here. What do we see? Signs of youth and a preference for physical attractiveness. So what do we know about women? Female fertility on average, it peaks in the mid-20s, and then it's very low by age 40. So we also see there's this strong universal cross-cultural preference for young women, for youth about that age. As men get older, we also see they tend to date women who are younger than them than age. So first age gaps of a first marriage, about 3 years. Age gaps in a second marriage, about 5 years. Age gaps in a third marriage, about 8 years. So we see that men kind of increasingly show preferences down. I've done, you know, a few surveys myself on age gap preferences, and that's what I see in my data as well. You look at men who are like 20, and it's like the women they prefer are also kind of like 20. You look at men who are like 60, and they're saying, yeah, my ideal woman is 40, okay? So even then, it's not necessarily that all men across the board just like prefer a woman who's like 25, even though that is the most fertile phase. But we do see both really strong, like expressed and revealed age gap preferences, right? The average age gap that men and women say they want, which is about 4 years, is also really close to the average age gap that men and women actually end up in real relationships. So we also see this preference for physical attractiveness, as I mentioned. That's probably, you know, Physical attractiveness in women is probably associated with youth and fertility and all of that as well. So facial femininity, often a sign of fertility. Low waist to hip ratio, that was one that, was hypothesized to be a sign of fertility, but not mentioned in this paper. There is a recent meta-analysis. I know I've maybe done a video on it or at least posted about it on social media that found actually there's no association with waist to hip ratio and fertility. So it's not that clear, but these are kind of some universal preferences. Okay, facial femininity, low waist to hip ratio. Let's go on some more male specific long-term mating preferences, okay? Paternity certainty, right? Being sure that the woman who you are with is actually carrying your child. Because this is not something that would be entirely clear, especially in ancestral environments. The woman is always the one carrying the baby in her body. She's always going to be 100% certain that it's hers, not the case for men. So there's always a risk for men of, essentially cuckoldry, right? There's a risk of investing in the genes of another man, providing all of that time and resources, raising the offspring of another man, could not be yours. So men have evolved strategies kind of to cope with this, right? Adaptations to deal with this higher risk. We see, for example, higher mate guarding behavior in men in some cases, and particularly within the emotion of jealousy. Something that we see is when you look at these studies on sexual versus emotional jealousy, what do we see? Men tend to score higher in sexual jealousy than women do, meaning men respond with more jealousy to sexual infidelity than women do. Now, this is not to say women do not also respond highly to that, because this is not something that men or women like very much. Conversely, emotional jealousy, women actually, you see kind of the opposite effect, right? For emotional jealousy, women tend to score a little bit higher in that. Why might that be? Emotional jealousy might represent for women abandoning the relationship, taking away all of that support that the male provides to parental care, right? Protecting the offspring, providing for the offspring, protecting the woman, etc., etc. Conversely, for men, sexual infidelity represents, okay, I could be raising a child that's not mine. We see some evidence for sperm displacement. It's mentioned in this paper. I'm actually not sure how consistent the research is on that. I've seen some conflicting research as well, but kind of the shape of the male penis, for example. It's been hypothesized, okay, this can be used to displace the sperm of other men, to reduce the conception likelihood of other men that may have had sex with the same woman. And perhaps most importantly to the point here, what we see behaviorally, psychologically, is the selection of faithful mates. We know that there's really strong preferences for chastity in women, okay, but there's not actually universal support for these kinds of sex differences. So in the 37 countries examined in the study that they mention, I think also from one of David Buss's big papers, 62% there was a sex difference. Men valued chastity more. But what do we see? Men are sensitive to cues of infidelity, of promiscuity, that kind of a thing. What this could mean as well, because we don't actually see a preference for virgins in all of these cultures. And across cultures, or when you look at what's the ideal mate preference, I've done a little bit on this myself. There's more recent research even in this paper on this, and it's you ask people, how many sexual partners in your partner is ideal? Men don't just say virgin across the board, but men and women both, they say a very low number of partners, right? So it's 2 or 3 or something like that. So it kind of goes up a little bit, 1, 2, 3, and then it starts to drop off, and it's oh, then it's bad. So there's something about having no sexual partners that is a little bit less ideal as far as what people report than having 1 or 2 in the past. Not sure exactly why that is. But what that could mean, that they mentioned here in this paper, is that future fidelity is more important than virginity. So it's not the case that men are I need a virgin. It's really important to have a virgin. It's more I need to know that this person is going to be faithful to me. I need to know that they're not promiscuous, that there's not a high risk of them leaving the relationship or a high risk of them cheating and becoming impregnated by another man, whatever the case may be there. So sexual fidelity as well, it's one of the top male mating preferences across cultures. It's something that is really important to men. I want a woman who's not going to cheat on me, basically, okay? And men also pay more attention than women do to past mating history as well. I'll refer to some of the surveys I've ran. For example, a high body count for men, when men are saying, what's a high body count for women? Men say, 10, 20 or so. Women, it's almost double that. It's 40. So women are a little bit less sensitive to high body counts. But again, mentioning the other research by Andrew Thomas, Steve Stewart Williams, they've done some on this. Also, some of my own research on this. People, men and women both, they still view high promiscuity negatively in the opposite sex. So it's not the case that a man who has had a lot of sexual partners is viewed positively by women, But a man who's had a lot of sexual partners is viewed positively by other men. Perhaps intuitively, surprisingly, I don't know. That's a topic for another video. You know, it's a status signal to other men, but it's a risk to women and it's a risk to men when men see that behavior in women. Anyway, men pay more attention to past mating history or promiscuity than women do, in some cases a little bit. And to men and women both, yeah, this is something they're looking for. Like, what's their behavior going to be in the future? Anyway, let's go on now to the next slide. Some female-specific long-term mating preferences, okay? Going back to this, parental investment theory by Trivers, we know that women face this unique challenge. They're raising the baby in their own body. They got to care for that baby once it's born and that sort of a thing. Pregnancy itself can limit resource acquisition. Women can forage and hunt. They can hunt small game. There are, big sex differences in hunting large game. But being pregnant can limit that. So women are vulnerable. Women have a very high and unique kind of challenge in raising offspring that men don't have. So would having a mate who can help protect her, acquire resources for her, go out and hunt and all of that, specifically within the context of pregnancy, be helpful? I mean, yeah, of course it would. So in that case, women might have a special adaptation for seeking men who have kind of an ability and a willingness to provide, okay? So across cultures, what do we see? That women value traits that are linked to resource acquisitions. And we see very, very large sex differences here, right? Women care about education in a partner the way that men don't. Women care about income the way that men don't. And it's not just like education or income, like, oh, he actually has more resources. It's behavioral and personality traits that indicate that. So there are things like, is he kind of a go-getter or something like that? Is he motivated? Is he ambitious? Is a big cross-cultural one that I think Buss has also looked at. Something like that. Does he seem like he is capable of doing it? So sometimes the potential for that resource acquisition is almost more important, or even, I think it actually is, than like what does he have kind of at the moment. So there's these two things, he has resources, he's able to get resources, he's not a lay around bum or whatever the case may be, et cetera, et cetera. So there's also the problem of protection, okay? Men need to invest, they need to protect and all of that. Invest, protect, okay? And so because women kind of rely on men to be a sort of bodyguard in their vulnerable situations and that kind of a thing, there's also a desire for physical traits that signal a man is able to protect, and also for behavioral traits that signal a man is able to protect. What are those? Height, physical strength, muscularity, formidability, like facial cranial formidability, that kind of a thing, neck size, behavioral dominance, is he not going to get bullied by other men, that kind of a thing. And also like bravery is a big one that you see across cultures. So an ability to protect physically, physical traits, and also a behavioral ability to protect. Is he kind of able to stand up for himself and protect the woman? Will he do that? Or is, he going to be a little pansy and run away, whatever the case may be. Let's go on now. We can look at here some condition-specific shifts in mating preferences also. So, personal mate value, all right? How high is your own mate value? How many desirable traits do you have relative to other people, or even in absolute standards, right? What do we know from this? People who are more desirable, who have higher mate value, they also have higher standards. This is even more the case for women, but it's also the case for men. So, pickier people tend to be higher in mate value. They're also more likely, a very interesting paper, maybe I'll try to link it in this, but it looked at a modeling for a Euclidean kind of model that can predict this, and it found, okay, people higher in mate value, they're pickier across all of these traits, but also they're also more likely to be able to fulfill their pickiness. So if you've ever wondered, like, what's your own mate value, you can just kind of look at what kind of men or women you attract, and like, that's your mate value right there. But consider as well something like the dark triad. We know these are antisocial traits. They're associated with antisocial behavior, low socioeconomic status, things like being in jail and all of that. And there's a lot of research on the dark triad that says, okay, is it attractive or not? I'm writing something on that now. It doesn't seem that consistent that's actually associated with attractiveness, but we do know that individuals higher in the dark triad have greater mating success. They have more children and that sort of thing. But we know that having lower mate value is also associated with lower standards. So these are people that are less picky. And we know that again from research on the dark triad, that individuals who score high in the DT also have lower standards. Basically, they're just willing to shoot down. They're willing to have sex with multiple people, lower investment. So of course, fertility, having more children, that might be kind of a given. These are short-term life history strategists. Higher mate value individuals, perhaps long-term mate history strategists. Anyway, Sex ratio is another condition-specific factor, right, that can cause these shifts. Are there more men, or are there more men or women or whatever, they, thems, in the environment, okay? Consider, men die in wars, women also have actually died a lot. And there's an interesting paper that said, female mortality across many periods might actually be higher than male mortality, even despite war. But whatever. Sometimes you end up with environments where there's a lot of men, there's not many women, or there's a lot of women, there's not that many men. This change mating strategies, okay? So what happens when there's more women and there's fewer men? Men and women both engage in more short-term mating strategies, right? Men are more able to exercise short-term mating strategies. They can play the field, they can have sex with a woman and leave and find another woman easily. What happens when there's more men and there's fewer women? Well, we know that women have a much stronger orientation toward long-term mating. We know that men have a much stronger orientation towards short-term mating, one of the sex differences in sociosexuality, one of the very large, well-replicated sex differences in sociosexuality, right? That kind of this long-term, short-term orientation. So when there's more men and men have to compete to do what women want and enter the kind of mating arrangements that women want, so to speak, remember, Trivers, Bateman gradient, that sort of a thing, then you see everyone engaging more in long-term mating strategies, okay? So that's how sex ratio can kind of impact things. What about something like disease and parasite prevalence, okay? So we know that physical attractiveness might be attractive, and this was kind of related to the good genes hypothesis of physical attractiveness. Now, not all of this research has replicated either, but that's, again, for a whole other topic. If physical attractiveness is attractive because it signals good genes, specifically immunocompetence, the ability to fend off parasites and disease and that sort of a thing, you might expect to see in environments where there's more of a parasite load, where there's more disease, where it's dirtier, that physical attractiveness is more important. And some research has shown that, but like they say in this paper as well, this kind of still needs some replication. I'm not sure that this is actually going to turn out to be true or not, but that's something you might see, assuming there is that relationship between physical attractiveness and health or something like that. Let's go on now to the next slide. Short-term mating preferences, okay? We see a very large sexual asymmetry in parental investment. Again, Trivers, parental investment theory. So this can lead us to some predictions that we can make in accord with sexual strategies theory, okay? Men have a stronger desire for short-term mates than women do, would be one. Men want more sexual partners or more sexual variety than women do. Men are willing to have sex earlier than women. They're willing to have committed sex, or uncommitted sex, I should say, more often than women, more of an interest in casual sex, and men will lower their standards more in short-term contexts more than women. There's very robust support for all of these across cultures. So these, again, seem to be kind of universals. And not only that, these are large sex differences, okay? These effect sizes all tend to be large as well. Cohen's D's of, above 0.7. So big effect sizes, cross-culturally replicated, sex differences in kind of these short-term mating preferences between men and women. Let's go on, look at the next one here. What kind of short-term adaptations might we see then that apply just to women, okay? Acquisition of immediate resources, and often, I don't see this discussed a lot, I'm not sure why, but trading sex for resources immediately, we even see that in primates, that primates will just offer up sex in exchange for meat. And so, in a survival situation, you might see that. Where might you see that in a modern environment? Sex work, right? So acquiring good genes is another potential reason for these short-term adaptations, right? That a short-term hookup or something like that can help you acquire good genes while you still have perhaps a primary partner whose genes are not so good, right? Related to the dual mate hypothesis. This hasn't replicated very well for many reasons. I'm sure I've talked about that, I think, in multiple videos. But that, is one potential adaptation. These don't all have to be true. But evaluating short-term mates as potential long-term mates. So again, related to the evolution of extended sexuality in women or concealed estrus, right? A lot of animals only have sex during the conceptive phase. The rest of the month or whatever, they are just not interested in sex. They don't have sex. They only have sex when they're fertile and they can get pregnant. Not the case in humans. Humans have sex every day of the month, right? Why? Why did human beings, almost not totally uniquely, but kind of uniquely compared to many animals, evolve that way? Well, being able to have sex with someone without getting pregnant might let you evaluate them as a potential long-term mate, okay? You might say, okay, this is someone who I could see is committed to me and they're having sex and they're still sticking around, or the sex is good, which might signal pair bonding, a capacity to pair bond, or even, genetic compatibility, that kind of a thing. So it lets women perhaps evaluate men before making a long-term commitment, which for women in this case would mean pregnancy, okay? What else could it be? Mate switching, moving from one long-term mate to a new one. So again, short-term strategies for women are not necessarily just exclusively short-term sex that's like wham bam, thank you ma'am, like we tend to think of men. It can be that, okay, women are, playing the waters because they want to leave one long-term relationship that they're already in and enter another, and kind of these short-term strategies can be a springboard into that. So we'll go forward. We can look at these in a little bit more depth. As I mentioned, this good genes hypothesis, okay, which is also the dual mate hypothesis. Most research on women's short-term mating preferences have looked at this good genes hypothesis. It was very popular kind of until fairly recently, in which case it doesn't replicate, and a lot of evolutionary psychology has moved away from this now. I don't know of any big proponents of like dual mating strategy at this point in evolutionary psychology, but it doesn't mean that it's just like completely out the window, but it probably doesn't explain like most of what's going on in most contexts. So good genes, ovulatory shifts. What is that? Ovulatory shifts would support this, right? That there's this desire for extra pair partners, extra pair sex, but research on this has been mixed. So ovulatory shifts, when the woman is ovulating, she's more likely to get pregnant. Does she have more desire for extra pair partners? Research on this, it's been weak, it's been mixed. Most results are negative. When there are positive results, they tend to have small effects. And again, the last video I made was on this. So again, this is the dual mate hypothesis of ovulatory shifts. Doesn't seem to replicate that well. Good genes, according to David Buss here, this hypothesis also has some theoretical issues as well as issues regarding, empirical evidence, failed replications, okay? The question is, all of this research on short-term mating selection, is it for the selection of good genes? Has looked at these physical traits. Doesn't seem to be that they really pan out. But why don't we see them for behavioral traits, right? We know, again, that personality traits, behavior, and all of that are heritable. So the selection for good genes should not just be a selection for physical traits. It should also be a selection for behavioral traits. But we don't see that. So if women change preferences during ovulation, could it just be due to that? Why are these good genes, only a select number of physical traits that ever seem to kind of show up, but none of these other heritable traits? Also another theoretical issue is kind of like, if women change preferences during ovulation, does that actually show a preference shift during ovulation, or could that show an increase in mate value that changes their preferences? So we know, for example, that women have kind of a higher mate value when they're ovulating. They get rated as more attractive behaviorally, physically, and that sort of thing. It's not always clear that men can tell. I don't think the research is super conclusive on that, but some indicates that it is, and when women are ovulating, they're rated as more attractive and all of that. So we know that people change their preferences based on their own mate value. Given that, do we really know that there's a preference shift, or do women just kind of recalibrate during that phase? Anyway, some theoretical issues there with the good genes hypothesis, and also some empirical issues, basically, that it doesn't seem to replicate very well. Let's go on. Next slide. So we have this, the mate switching hypothesis, which is kind of the newer thing, right? David Buss originated this as well. The research seems to be much more consistent with this. So what is this? The mate switching hypothesis. So we know that it can facilitate kind of getting backup mates lined up, okay? If something happens to the primary partner, you're not all alone. So we know that men and women both cultivate backup mates. People, who are friends, who are in the background, like, oh, if something were to happen here, maybe this person would be available. Sometimes these things turn into affairs. Sometimes they're just kind of there. We know that people, for example, select friends who have the same qualities that they would desire in a mate, which, should make you question, can men and women just be friends? You ask me, it's shaky ground. I think not. But short-term mating in that sense isn't just, acquiring good genes, but it's mate insurance. It's saying, I have a short-term mate over here. I got a long-term mate over here. Something happens to my long-term mate, I got my affair partner, my short-term mate, or whatever the case may be over here as a backup. They're going to replace them, right? They're not just exclusively a short-term mate. They're a potential long-term mate. Again, remember, for women, short-term mating strategies can be a springboard into long-term mate formation. Short-term sexual encounters, we know that they make it easier to leave a current relationship. When people leave one relationship for another, it's much easier for them, okay? So kind of exploring the field. We know this allows kind of trading up to a better partner, and a better partner in that case is not just like, oh, he made $1 million, but this guy makes $1.5 million. It's often like, I'm miserable in this relationship, and like, I'm in love with this person, okay? So there's a lot of emotional things that go into this. It's not just kind of a Machiavellian, like, I'm trading up because I'm just always looking for like the best, kind of the caricature of hypergamy that you see in the manosphere or whatever, okay? Short-term mating can also be kind of a barometer of one's own mate value. So people might do this kind of to calibrate like where they are. Is my current mate suitable for me? Well, what kind of other mates can I get? Who else will have sex with me? Who else is willing to date me, or whatever the case may be. So then it can be like, okay, this is kind of my level. And that can kind of let people select someone on their own mate value. So let's go on now to the next slide. We'll look at some evidence that supports the mate switching hypothesis. Relationship dissatisfaction. What do we know? Well, it's one of the top predictors of infidelity in women, but not for men. Why do women cheat? They're unhappy in their relationship. Why do men cheat? Because the sex is there and it's available. So, in other words, men will cheat on a perfectly good relationship. They will cheat on someone that they're kind of happy with because they're seeking more sexual variety. And, I say men will do this. I'm talking in averages here. I'm talking in sex differences. I'm not saying all men are going to do this. I'm not saying all women are going to do this. I'm just speaking on average. These are average sex differences, okay? Women cheat, in other words, to find new relationships. Men cheat for sexual novelty, okay? Relationship dissatisfaction. What else does it predict? Women's interests in other men, for one, across all phases of the ovulatory cycle, contrary to the dual mate hypothesis of ovulatory shifts, where you would expect these preferences only to shift during ovulation. So, what do we know? When women are unhappy in a relationship, when they're not strongly bonded, and you can again look at like Paul Eastwick's adaptive workaround hypothesis again in the last video, they have more interest in extra pair mates when they're not bonded, when relationship satisfaction is low. What happens when relationship satisfaction is high? When they like the person they're with. It's the opposite effect, okay? Women suppress extra pair desire. They have more attraction for their own partner when they're ovulating, okay? So relationship dissatisfaction predicts women's interest in other men during all phases. Woman is dissatisfied, she wants to leave, okay? This is not something you would expect in the dual mate hypothesis. Why? Because the extra pair partner is not about leaving the relationship. It's simply a temporary thing to acquire good genes. How happy you are in the current relationship should not matter at all. Only kind of the quality of the sire, right? Like, I got to get good genes over here because this guy's genes are just not so great. But if it's like, I'm unhappy in this relationship, so I'm going to cheat elsewhere, well, then maybe elsewhere is where they're looking to replace their partner with a new long-term partner, right? So not dual mating, but mate switching, okay? Women's reported reasons, so, asking, self-reports in this case, what are they very, very consistently when you ask, why did you have an affair? They want to replace their current partner, okay, consistent. It makes it easier for them to break up, consistent, right? Or they want to discover newer, better partners, right? Kind of consistent with that mate value calibration. What else do we know? In a primary partner, when long-term mate value traits decline, okay, so the things that make someone desirable as a long-term mate decline, that is when women also seek extra pair partners. Again, so if the extra pair partner was simply a short-term thing and not a potential long-term mate, long-term relationship satisfaction or whatever would not predict like seeking elsewhere, okay? They're seeking elsewhere because they want to replace the long-term partner with someone who has better long-term prospects. Anyway, next slide. A little bit more evidence for this, okay? We also know that most women, 79%, they report falling in love with their affair partner. Now, this is really important. It's much lower for men. And love is an evolved pair bonding device to form long-term relationships. So what if acquisition of a short-term partner was just for good genes while you maintained a primary partner in a long-term relationship? Falling in love with that short-term partner, that would not be adaptive. That would be maladaptive. It would be counterproductive, wouldn't it? You're not trying to dissolve the current relationship. You're not trying to mate switch. You just want like a hookup and get the good genes, and then you're back in your relationship. But if you're falling in love with that other person and you're considering leaving the relationship and you think that they're better, that's because you're considering them as a long-term partner. So the fact that many more women than men fall in love with an affair partner, and in fact it's a very large majority of men, says, okay, they're considering a long-term relationship with that person. In fact, they've already started the process of bonding to them as a long-term partner, right? By falling in love. That's what it is. The qualities that women desire in their affair partners, they're the same as in long-term mates, okay? Minimum 70th percentile rank in being dependable, emotionally stable, successful, honest, intelligent, mature, and unselfish. So these are long-term behavioral traits. If it was just physical good genes, these traits like facial masculinity, none of that would matter. But women assess affair partners, mate switching and all that, highly for traits that would make them good long-term partners. What else do we know? Perhaps a big blow to this. If the dual mating strategy were a common adaptation, a common mating strategy, we would expect this to occur in the genetic record, that there would be a lot of cuckoldry, right? That there would be a lot of cases, where the primary partner is not raising their own child, where they are not the sire of their own child. The child is sired by, again, the short-term partner over here. The extra pair paternity rates across all of the research, genetic research, modern research, whatever the case may be, too low kind of to support dual mating or ovulatory shifts as a common strategy. It's less than 3%. So it's just not something that's happening, that commonly. Most women acquire good genes from their long-term partner. And if you look again to the past video, we're looking at something by Gangstead, who was the originator of the dual mate hypothesis. He's gone on to say now he's not even sure if the dual mate hypothesis is real. So the man who came up with the dual mate hypothesis, he's now saying, yeah, I don't really think that this is correct. But last video, if you go and look at that, something that's explained in a paper by him, he says, even if an extra pair partner has better genes than the primary partner, in most cases, according to all of this evolutionary logic here, it's still going to be more beneficial to acquire genes from the primary partner, given all of the benefits from provisioning that they provide. Anyway, big blows there to the dual mate hypothesis. Big support for the mate switching hypothesis. And this is kind of, the current direction in evolutionary psychology between these two at the moment. Anyway, next slide going on. Mate switching versus good genes. Quotation from David Bust here from the paper. The good genes and mate switching hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. A small minority of women in some contexts could successfully implement a dual mating strategy and secure good genes from an affair partner, while other women who have affairs are implementing one or another variant of mate switching. I suggest that the mate switching hypothesis provides a more parsimonious explanation for the function of infidelity in most women. So, next slide, sexual selection through mate competition. This is, again, going back to the beginning of the video, what we talked about here. We have this intersexual selection, choosing mates, but we also have intrasexual competition and selection, right? Men beating other men to be chosen. So, contest competition. Darwin noted these. Males physically outcompete another. They physically prevent other males, from mating, right? They prevent them physically from sexual access to females. So these are these physical contest competitions. Now, up until recently, it was claimed that these were kind of low in humans, but there are some evolutionary psychologists now that kind of argue, yeah, maybe that's not the case. David Putz, I think, evolutionary anthropologist, he's done a lot of research on this. It says, actually, this might be kind of high, this contest competition. We seem to have adaptations and that kind of a thing that would indicate, that it happened in our ancestral past and all of that. So we see low levels of sexual dimorphism relative to other primates, which historically, would have been interpreted as evidence for lower contest competition. But it's still high relative to females, right? We don't just see no sexual dimorphism or sexual dimorphism that is so low that you can't tell a male and a female apart like you can in many, many animals, right? Men have much more robust craniums, orbitofacial structures and that kind of a thing, preventing, brain damage from getting punched in the face, basically. We also see very high levels of male-on-male aggression, right? Especially in groups or coalitions. War is a good example, right? Human beings are really good at killing each other. Men are really good at killing each other, especially in coordinated groups. When we engage in aggression, we kind of use our brains. We're not necessarily just throwing fists. Anyway, next slide. Non-physical competition. This is going to be much more common, isn't it? And this often just comes down to the derogation of rivals, okay? Remember, as we said, the mate preferences of one sex define the intrasexual competition of the opposite sex. So the things that women value are the things that men are going to compete over, and they're the things that men are going to kind of derogate rivals over, okay? So if women like kindness, men may battle men over being the most kind. And conversely, men may derogate rivals on those traits that are attractive. So instead of being like, he's so kind, they're going to be like, he's not kind. They're going to say, he's mean and he's dumb and he just wants to use you. He just wants to have sex. He doesn't want to commit to you. So he's mean, the opposite of kind. He's dumb, so he's the opposite of intelligent, right? He just wants to use you. So, he's not a suitable long-term mate. They're not a nice guy, right? Very common, this kind of nice guy discourse, okay? And men do the same. What do men say about women? She's a bimbo. She's a slut. She has an STD. That's the kind of intersexual competition that women have. Slut shaming. Women do this to each other more than men do this to women. A lot of this female intersexual competition has to come down to this. fidelity, chastity, health, right? She has an STD or something like that. So that's kind of how women derogate it. Women's insults toward other women attack the traits that men find attractive. Men's insults toward other men attack the traits that women find attractive in men. Okay. Women derogate the attractiveness of other women more because men value physical attractiveness more than women do. Men value fidelity and chastity a little bit more. So of course, women derogate the purity of other women. Let's go on. Next one. Mate poaching, mate guarding, other sexual strategies here, okay? Intrasexual competition. What is one way that occurs? We try to lure mates away from rivals, right? Someone, that kind of a thing. People try to poach mates. It's called mate poaching. And we have evolved strategies to defend against this. Mate guarding, mate poaching, mate guarding. Okay, so one way that we guard mates is provisioning, right? Benefit enhancing mate guarding. That's simply being a better mate, right? Being there physically, protecting, enhancing your own mate value, providing more resources, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, there's cost-inflicting mate retention strategies or mate guarding, making it hard to leave physically, right? Intimidating them. People hit their mates so that they don't cheat, or they, put a burqa on them or whatever so that other people can't see. They sequester them. So mate guarding also includes adaptations where men become more vigilant to rivals. So if people feel more jealousy or more threats, again, jealousy is probably an emotion that evolved to facilitate mate guarding, right? And mate guarding evolved to facilitate the maintenance of these long-term pair bonds. Now, some of these things, like cost-inflicting mate retention strategies, they might not work that well in a modern environment, so you get what's called evolutionary mismatch. If you just beat your partner so that she doesn't cheat or leave, you might just go to jail, she might just leave anyway. In an ancestral environment, or in past modern environments, or I should say past historical environments, that might not necessarily be the case. That might have actually been an effective tactic to, retain a mate and make sure that, you keep them in line, so to speak. But doesn't work in a modern environment. I don't recommend it. Anyway, what do women do? What's one way they do this? Increasing sexual behavior for a mate that they like. When women are very invested and a man is not, again, see the past video, women will engage in more sexual behavior. They'll have sex more frequently. When a mate is of higher value as well, especially if there's a mate value discrepancy relative to an individual, then people also engage in more mate guarding behaviors, and they also engage in more mate retention behaviors, right? You have a high value mate and you're kind of insecure that they're going to leave. Then you really get kind of that combination where jealousy is very high and where, there's a lot of watching out, like what are they doing? Who are they talking to? And that kind of a thing. This occurs when there's a discrepancy, and it also occurs for individuals who are simply higher in mate value to begin with, even if there's not as much of a discrepancy. So basically people care more when they have a high value mate, okay? Sometimes I see people that are like, oh, I'm not jealous or anything like that. And I really just wonder, like, well, how much do you really like them? Maybe you're not that jealous because you're not afraid that they have many options or that they're going to leave, or you just don't like them that much. And the thoughts, kind of in the back of your mind there, the semi-conscious thoughts are just kind of like, they're not going to leave, which, might not be the case if someone is very, very high value. You might realize like, well, they got a lot of options, they wouldn't be alone. Anyway, so there's kind of this cycle here for, the whole mating process, right? Attraction to mates, competition for mates, then you have relationship maintenance, mate guarding, mate poaching, mate switching, that kind of thing. Sometimes people try to get their mates back, they move on, they find a new mate. Yeah, Hakuna Matata, the cycle of life. So another one here, sexual coercion, right? The R word, okay? So this could be a third form of sexual selection. And what this is essentially bypassing mate choice, right? The mate is not choosing, you're forcing yourself upon them. So sequestering a mate, punishment, intimidation, force, the R word, all of that. Okay, I'm saying this because I don't know if I'm allowed to say it on YouTube. Intertwined with mate selection, okay? Males might use force because they're not actually selected, right? So they're being pushed out of the voluntary mating market. Oh, got to use force now. Is that actually the case? Research doesn't actually seem to support that, but that's one hypothesis. Sexual coercion may also look like male-male competitions, right? Killing rivals, capturing the women, that kind of a thing. There is debate over if this is actually a coercive adaptation, if it's actually an evolved adaptation, right? Did we evolve an adaptation to, commit the R word? There doesn't have to be an adaptation for individuals to engage in this behavior, but it's a common behavior, it happens. So mate deprivation hypothesis, I kind of touched on this a minute ago. This is the idea that force is a tactic used by males who can't secure female mate choice. So you have a group of men, they're pushed out of society or whatever the case may be. They're not being picked. So they're using force now to get their mating desire met. This isn't something, according to this paper, that's wholly supported. It doesn't seem to be the case that coercive males are actually the least sexually successful. So a lot of the time, you have sexually coercive males. They also have, voluntary sexual relationships, wives or whatever the case may be. They're not necessarily incels, okay? So sexual coercion, as I said, it can still occur without a coercion-specific adaptation. It's common. We see that it does occur. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's selected for, but whatever, it happens. It could still be considered another mating strategy. Anyway, that is the video. Chapter 1 from the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology of Mating Strategies or Human Relationships. I forget. You would have to see the first slide. Hope you liked the video. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. Go join the Patreon. Support the project. I'm going to do something. I'm going to go through every single chapter in this Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. I'm going to make a video on each one of these. I'm going to make a playlist, and you'll have a big lecture series for understanding all of the current research in evolutionary psychology. But support it, join the Patreon. Anyway, have a good one. I will make another video for you very soon.